everyone. Good morning, everyone. This is the public hearing and a public meeting of the Committee of the Whole regarding bills number 250195, 250196, 250197, 250198, 250199, 250200, 250201, 250202, 250210, 250212, and resolution number 250214. Ms. Lawhead, would you please call the roll to take attendance?
Councilmember Squilla, Councilmember Gautier, Councilmember Jones, Councilmember Jones, Councilmember Young, Councilmember Driscoll, Councilmember Lozada, Councilmember Bass, Councilmember Phillips, Councilmember O'Neill, Councilmember Gilmore Richardson, Councilmember Thomas, Councilmember Harity, Councilmember Ahmad, Councilmember Landau, Councilmember Brooks, Councilmember O'Rourke, Council President Johnson.
Present. Thank you. A quorum of the committee is present, and this hearing is now called to order. Ms. Lawhead, will you please read the title of the resolutions?
Bill number 250195, an ordinance amending Chapter 19-1500 of the Philadelphia Code entitled Wage and Net Profits Tax by revising certain tax rates under certain terms and conditions. Bill number 250196, an ordinance adopting the operating budget for fiscal year 2026. Bill number 250197, an ordinance to adopt a fiscal 2026 capital budget. Bill number 250198, an ordinance to adopt a capital program for the 6 fiscal years 2026 through 2031 inclusive. Bill number 250199, an ordinance amending Chapter 19-2600 of the Philadelphia Code entitled Business Income and Receipts Taxes to revise certain tax rates and end certain exclusions from the tax on receipts, all under certain terms and conditions. Bill number 250200, an ordinance amending Chapter 12-1000 of the Philadelphia Code entitled Traffic Code to revise the fee for the use of parking meters, all under certain terms and conditions. Bill number 250201, an ordinance amending Chapter 19-1800 of the Philadelphia Code entitled School Tax Authorization to provide for an increase in the tax the Board of Education of the School District of Philadelphia is authorized to impose on real estate, and amending Chapter 19-1300 entitled Real Estate Taxes to establish an equivalent reduction in the tax rate for the city real estate tax, all under certain terms and conditions. Bill number 250202, an ordinance amending Section 19-1806 of the Philadelphia Code entitled Authorization of Realty Use and Occupancy Tax to eliminate certain exemptions, all under certain terms and conditions. Bill number 250210, an ordinance amending Section 10-1001 of the Philadelphia Code entitled Fees of Commissioner of Records to increase the portion of fees for the recording of deeds and mortgages and related documents to be used for housing trust fund purposes under certain terms and conditions. Bill number 250211, an ordinance amending Chapter 19-1400 of the Philadelphia Code entitled a Realty Transfer Tax by revising the rate of the tax under certain terms and conditions. Bill number 250212, an ordinance to amend Chapter 19-4400 of the Philadelphia Code entitled Development Impact Tax and imposition of the tax under certain terms and conditions. Resolution number 250214, resolution providing for the approval by the Council of the City of Philadelphia of a revised 5-year financial plan for the City of Philadelphia covering fiscal years 2026 through 2030 and incorporating revisions with respect to fiscal year 2025, which is to be submitted by the Mayor to the Pennsylvania Intergovernmental Cooperation Authority pursuant to an intergovernmental cooperation agreement by and between the city and the authority.
Thank you very much. Today we continue the public hearing of the Committee of the Whole to consider the bills read by the clerk that constitute proposed operating and capital spending measures for fiscal year 2026, a capital program, and a forward-looking capital plan for fiscal year 2026 through fiscal year 2031. This morning, we will hear testimony from the Office of Homeless Services, and in the afternoon, we will hear testimony from the Fire Department and License and Inspections. As we are starting at 11 as opposed to 10, we will provide 2 minutes so members can ask directly their questions and we can have a response so we can get as much work that we can get done between now and 4 p.m. Ms. Lawhead, will you please call the first witness to testify?
The first person to testify is Cheryl Hill, Executive Director, Office of Homeless Services.
you could just state your name and title, and then you begin your testimony.
My name is Cheryl Hill, Executive Director of the Office of Homeless Services. Good morning, Council President Johnson and members of City Council. Joining me today are Chief of Staff David Holloman and Deputy Managing Director Crystal Yates-Gale. Our work is made possible by the support of our dedicated Office of Homeless Services colleagues, some of whom are with us in council chambers today, while others are currently hard at work serving our most vulnerable populations in Philadelphia. I am pleased to provide the testimony for the Office of Homeless Services proposed fiscal year 2026 operating budget. The Office of Homeless Services provides leadership, coordination, and planning and mobilization of resources to make homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring in the city's pursuit of the mayor's vision for a safer, cleaner, and greener city with access to economic opportunity for all. Philadelphia's homeless services system consists of more than 75 homeless, housing, and social service providers, mostly nonprofit, working together with local, state, and federal government entities. Since I stepped into the role of Executive Director in September, our team has been focused on strengthening OHS's foundation while setting bold goals for the future. For instance, we launched an agency improvement plan rooted in transparency, equity, and performance. We listened to staff at every level of our organization, identified inefficiencies, and began laying the groundwork for a culture of continuous improvement, one that supports our employees and better serves our city's most vulnerable residents. One of our first steps towards addressing this is to add more administrative staff to bolster our efficiency efforts agency-wide. Those positions are included in this proposed budget. Our proposed budget supports Mayor Parker's Home Initiative and Wellness Ecosystem. Both programs are critical pathways to ending street homelessness, offering options that meet people where they are, whether through recovery housing, supportive housing, or a hybrid model, anchored in dignity and tailored to individuals' needs. This will require a shift in how we approach housing referrals, assessments, and shelter stays, moving towards a system that reduces time in shelter and increases access to permanent housing with greater speed and equity. Prevention, diversion, and intake, or PD&I, remains the cornerstone of our approach, and we intend to modernize these services by streamlining application processing and leveraging technology to connect people to assistance faster and more efficiently. By collaborating with a wide range of governmental and community partners, OHS aims to reduce the number of individuals and families entering homelessness, ensuring that prevention services are accessible and effective in stabilizing households before crisis situations escalate. The Emergency and Temporary Housing Unit provides immediate shelter and short-term housing for people experiencing homelessness. OHS will work to reduce the length of stay in shelters by piloting initiatives that facilitate faster transitions from shelter to permanent housing, focusing on efficiency and client-centered care. In FY26, we plan to formalize the Enhanced Code Blue protocol piloted this winter to ensure that individuals experiencing homelessness have access to warming centers and safe shelter options during the extremely frigid temperatures. We've also implemented a new shelter monitoring process to make sure that every facility we fund offers safe, decent, and sanitary environments. Additionally, in FY26, we will complete the assessment of the City Fund emergency shelters in compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Providing permanent, safe, and affordable and accessible housing with wraparound services is the best way to resolve homelessness. We are also requesting the necessary resources to ensure that our nonprofit partners, many of which are on the front lines every day, can meet the city's living wage requirements without compromising the quality of their services. Fair pay for their workforce is not only a matter of equity, but essential to building a sustainable homelessness response system. The Fiscal Contracts and Asset Management System, or FCAM, division will prioritize equity and accountability in its policies, practices, and provider network to ensure fair and inclusive service access. We will continue our review to ensure equitable processes, adherence to our policies or contracts, and in an era of transparency, which I refer to with the team as the show your work model. In addition to the in addition to the internal process review, we are working with a consulting firm to look at our fiscal practices to see how we can improve established key controls in our fiscal operations. Once the risk assessments and recommendations are finalized, the results will be shared with Council. Earlier this year, in collaborations with our colleagues in the Managing Director's Office and Finance, OHS took a proactive look at our fiscal oversight and payment processes to ensure we maintain operations as funded in FY25. Once it was confirmed that the FY25 budget obligations were funded as planned, a $4.7 million reserve was established to support unanticipated costs in FY25. Funding from the reserve was subsequently earmarked for Enhanced Code Blue, wage increases for our service providers, and an infusion of homeless prevention assistance dollars and funding for facility maintenance. The proposed fiscal year 2026 general fund budget totals $84,188,038, a decrease of $5,055,830 from the fiscal year 2025 estimated obligation levels. This decrease is primarily due to the allocation of one-time funding in FY25 for unanticipated needs and the transition of budget authority to other departments for contracts previously managed by OHS, such as facilities management and security at Philly Home at Girard. However, it does not signify a decrease in the administration's prioritization and dedication to addressing the homelessness crisis. Instead, we are continuing to break down silos and create a holistic strategy. The wellness budget under the Managing Director's Office includes new funding for wellness vouchers that will be administered by OHS to provide a seamless transition from recovery housing, such as Riverview Village, to permanent housing using a model similar to rapid rehousing. In addition, the Home Initiative includes strategies to prevent homelessness, as well as preserve or build housing units for people at or below 30% AMI. OHS will also continue to partner with PHA, DHCD, and PHDC to leverage funding programs such as the Federal Home Investment Partnership Program, HTF, LIHTC set-asides to strengthen our efforts to end homelessness. Our proposed budget allows OHS to continue funding our existing programs with increases to accommodate the city's minimum wage, increase winter and code blue services, and add fiscal administrative staff to ensure contracts are accurate and completed in a timely manner. This budget strategy was developed by taking into consideration all of our resources, including other funding sources such as grants and strategic public and private partnerships. Meanwhile, the Planning, Policy, and Performance Division, also known as P3, will launch a new strategic planning process with the Continuum of Care Board and service providers to ensure alignment with Mayor Parker's Home Initiative. OHS will also continue the collaborative review of our Continuum of Care initiatives and application process as we work to safeguard and increase our permanent supportive housing units. Thank you for the opportunity to share how OHS, with the ceaseless support of our dedicated team members, strives to meet its mission every day and will continue to do more in an effective manner. And before I turn it over and look forward to answering your questions, I do want to just say publicly thank you to Dave Holloman, who has been a partner with me even before I joined the city, and it continues to help with the strategies today. Thank you.
Thank you. We're glad to see Dave is still here taking care of business since the last time we saw you, Dave. Continue to keep up the good work, okay? Thank you. The chair recognizes Majority Leader Councilman Catherine Gilmore Richardson.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Council President. And thank you all very, very much for your testimony and for the work of the entire OHS team. We all have been working really closely over the last year. So I wanted to thank Cheryl Hill, and welcome you to your first budget season. Also to Dave Holloman for all of your work. And then I want to give a shout out to Bruce Johnson, who's been helping us place a number of individuals who are unhoused and getting them connected to service. Even helped us on a Saturday evening with an elderly woman who was in a car outside of a park. So I just wanted to make sure that I put that on the record because I recognize that this work is not easy work, it's difficult work, it's selfless work, and you're meeting many Philadelphians at their lowest and at their point of need. And so I just wanted to thank you all very much for that work. I also wanted to ensure that I put on the record that since 2018, City Council has increased OHS's budget by $41 million. So I think the commitment is there from City Council that we want to fund this work. We want to fund good quality service from our OHS. And then you all know that we worked together closely over the past several months to ensure we had additional dollars for the family intake shelter, which you all did get up and running in the Northwest in Councilmember Cindy Bass's district. So I'm very, very appreciative of that. You know that I have to ask the tough questions only because, we have to get this on the record. But I know that we all collectively care deeply about the quality of service that we're providing to our most vulnerable residents at their point of need. So it's just a few things that I wanted to also mention because we had just received this Pew report last week around the amount of Philadelphians who are experiencing homelessness in recent years. And, while we know that we've had a reduction in our city's poverty rate, which is the lowest it's been since 2000. We also know that household incomes, while they may be increasing slightly here, that too many families are cost burdened, and particularly by the strains that we have relative to housing and also utilities. And so we recognize that we've received a report that homelessness is on the rise in the city of Philadelphia, and that's the reason why I want to continue to have a laser beam focus on this issue. So I'm going to start off with a few questions, and everything that I ask are things that I really need to just get on the record so that we have a starting point for moving forward. I know that you all have a financial consultant. We were able to see that in the detail as well. And they have completed their review and their analysis of OHS, and they've issued recommendations. Have those recommendations been made public? And if you all could share those recommendations with the council president for dissemination to all members of council, including our chair of housing, Councilmember Gaudier, before we have the callback, is that possible?
Yes, it's possible. We just met with the consultants this week, so we just received the information. They gave us an updated draft this week as well, so we'll be able to share those recommendations with council.
Okay, and we'll be able to receive that before the callback?
Yes. Not the final, it's still a draft.
Okay,
Yes.
it's still a draft. Okay, but will you all be able to share anything with us prior to?
Call up Crystal Yates-Gill.
Okay.
Good morning, Majority Leader. Crystal Yates-Gale, Deputy Managing Director, Health and Human Services. The engagement with the fiscal consultant just started, so it's going in 3 phases. The first phase was a risk assessment. The second phase is going to be making recommendations to operationalize their recommendations to us. The third phase will be to implement training for the team. And so there is a report that is shared with us after each phase, and we have your team specifically, but council as a whole, on the books to be invited to that meeting.
Okay, that'll be great. I heard the bell, so I'll honor the clock. I just need to get this last question on for this round, and I'll come back hopefully for several rounds. On April 22nd of last year, the Inspector General released a report of preliminary findings around the overspending for OHS. I'm not sure, and just please let us know if a final report has been issued, if you all have received a final report from the OIG, and if not, if there's an update regarding that report.
So we've received the draft version, and we've met with OIG as well as the consultant that they've been working with, but we haven't received the final report.
Okay, so I'll then ask again, once you receive the final report, if we could receive a copy via our council president for dissemination to all members of council, and I'll come back on the second round. Thank you, Council President. Thank you. Thank you very much, Council President. Last year, you all provided my office with a list of all the FY 23 and 24 contracts. I still have a copy of it here, because we had to print it out the long way to go through it, and it's been a part of our Bible that we've been using for the last year. But you all were able to give me a list of all the FY 23 and 24 contracts, and it had the following information. The date the contract was conformed, the amount encumbered on the date of the contract confirmation, date of all the invoices for the work provided, date of all the payments with the invoice numbers, any funds that were rolled over from a previous contract and the contract number associated so that we can match it up, and any unpaid invoices from the previous contract that were paid under a FY 25 contract, which is some of the stuff that we could find. And I'll be honest, we've been up all night because we just got this at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So it's very difficult to be able to go through all of this and receive it at 4. And I know that's not to any fault of your own, but we have to also have an opportunity to go through it. And we had a budget town hall last night until 8 o'clock. So if you all could provide us with that same information this year, that would be helpful.
Thank you. And on behalf of the team, because it was a collaborative effort, we do want to apologize for getting that information to you so late, but we'll be able to give you that updated information.
Okay, and that would be for all the FY 25 contracts? And I'm only asking because of all the movement that's happening in the detail. When we did get it, we were still here. I was able to go through from my desk here the contracts that immediately stood out to me relative to the numbers that did not match up, and then I had my team do the research to ensure that what I thought I was reading was an accurate assessment. I'll get this last question on for this round, and I can come back. But I wanted to go under for emergency and temporary housing in Class 200, but specifically that portion of the detail on page 27. It shows a decrease in emergency and temporary housing of $4,531,571. That's in Class 250. $641,343 in Class 290, $1,632,710 decrease in 299. So the total decrease would be $6,805,623 in Class 200. Now, when you go back and go down in the further pages in 29, 30, and 31, and you review all the specific spending breakdowns on those pages, the numbers just don't add up. So it could be that is a typo, or that that's why we need to see the invoices so we'll be able to match it up. But the difference on those pages in the Class 250 is $4,906,906.70, and the Class 290 difference is $1,942,290. So essentially, the Class 299 difference is correct, but it is also a set-aside around the inflationary needs that you all are stating that you'll need to address. But there are no specifics on what the $2.7 million was spent on last year, and then what the $1.1 million appropriation may be spent on for next year. And so for the record, and you all might not be able to do this today, but I wanted to get this on the record, if you could explain the movement and around a discrepancy in the totals versus the line item spending in Class 200, and that would be strictly for emergency and temporary housing, and then provide the detail for the inflationary spending for FY 25 under that same category. And then specifically for the one-time costs on page 30, if you could provide the detailed information on the $1.9 million, I think that's for the facility needs. And then which vendors that we're going to work with, and sort of the timeline and the scope. So I'll start there, emergency and temporary housing.
Thank you, and we'll be able to get you the detail, but I'll add for clarity, as we went through this budget in detail, we realized that some of the projects were actually in the wrong department. So some of the moves were actually just putting them in the correct area, but we'll be able to get you more detail behind that.
Right, and that was the difference between, I thought, the original detail we received, and then we got an updated detail at 358, so to try to match it up. But basically, you know, typically when it's in the earlier section of the detail, and then once you get the breakdown on the following pages, that typically you're able to add up the numbers and it matches. But in this instance, it does not. So I wasn't sure if you understand where I'm going with that? Okay.
Yep.
Okay. For the additional increase in prevention support, you shared with our office in one of our many meetings that these funds were to provide additional dollars to those at risk of losing their rental units. And that's after a permanent supportive housing option did not pan out due to the rent costs. So could you please notate where in the detail we could see the original project and how it was budgeted?
Sure. So the original prevention dollars are primarily funded by grants, and we can give you the detail behind that. We realized, and we've mentioned it before in other council meetings, that we had the increase of individuals that experienced prevention, but just to provide clarity, not all of them need the permanent supportive housing dollars. They just need additional help with security deposit or just a few months' rent. So that's why it's a little bit different in that program. But what we found was that we ran through that money pretty quickly because we had about 4,000 people ask for assistance. And so now,
I saw the post.
Yes.
I saw the post. Everybody was sharing it online. I know what you're referring to.
yes, and so what we did do in the budget for FY25 was add additional funds to help cover some of those costs because we realized that we were out of the money probably around March. So we've added additional funds to be able to help so that we can provide support for more individuals.
Sure, and I only asked because it was only, I think it was $336,000 that was listed under the permanent supportive units for this fiscal year, but it's only one time. So if it's something that we need to continue to address, we would want to see it more than once, which is why I asked about the original detail so that we can understand if it moves somewhere, where it is.
Absolutely, and I will add that earlier this year, we added an additional $700,000 that you don't see separated out for specifically for prevention dollars, but because we awarded that a while ago, it's the only reason that it's not separated out in that funding, because that was specifically about using some of the additional reserve dollars where the $700,000 we were able to allocate out of our original budget.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Council President. I'll come back.
Thank you. The chair recognizes Councilman Curtis Jones Jr., then the chair of Housing, Councilwoman Jamie Gautier.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. And thank you, colleague, for raising this issue several cycles ago to talk about it from a macro point of view and fiscal stability. But I want to approach this from a micro standpoint. The way I look at government sometimes, if I see one pothole, I fix it. If I see several potholes, there's something wrong with the system. And thank you for meeting with me aside to kind of explain that system, and it gave us some insight as to some of the challenges that you have to face. So thank you for that in advance. I did give you some homework, and that homework was to provide a linear view of how people coming through different doors wound up in shelters, whether you come from a domestic abuse point of view, whether you come from an ex-offender point of view, whether you come from a child who is couch surfing. How do you do intake, and then what are the times associated before someone gets temporary to permanent placement? Did you get a chance to do that?
I'll turn that over to Dave Holloman.
Good morning, Council, and thank you for that question. Thank you again for having the time to meet with us. So just to give a quick synopsis of when someone comes through the door, whether it's from incarceration or coming from the streets or from a hospital, everyone comes through central intake and they get an assessment. And so you have the option to either have an overnight bed or what we consider to be case management bed, which we have 30 shelters that has case managers in those beds. That path leads to a long-term housing placement or a treatment placement. And so once you come through the first door, you get a housing assessment. And if you're in there for 7 days in that initial placement, you're meeting with a case manager to determine what type of housing.
I'm gonna stop you because I hear that. Did you do the chart?
Yes, we do have a chart, and we can turn it over to your officers through
And
Council
will
President.
you give that to the president to distribute to members? Because that gives us here's how long it takes, and as important, how much does it cost? So, for example, and I think you gave me a number before, how many people go through your system a year?
Let me answer that. Yeah, on average, we have seen anywhere between 15 to 19,000 people that come to our intake services. Doesn't mean that all of them get placed for housing, but they come in seeking some type of services.
And if you were to do a pie chart of who they are, tell me the demographic, tell me the circumstance of who your shelter participant is.
Yeah, as we have seen over the last few years and homelessness being up nationwide, we are starting to see more of an older population. That means when we say older, 55 and up, excuse me, 55 and up, and also we're starting to see youth, what we consider to be youth, 18 to 24 years of age. But the biggest population of people is in that age between 25 to 45, where we see the majority of people that come to our system. But we can provide in that infographic a breakdown of a pie chart showing who's hitting our system for first times and also repeated people who are coming in.
So as we are, I know I heard the bell. How much does it cost a night?
Yeah, on average, we spend about $55 per night, depending on the shelter. Some of that can range between $55 upwards to $85, depending on the type of services and the type of shelter based on square footages, location, if it's a recent lease.
So for the next round, the question that I want answered is, and again, the best examples are examples that come through my office, and one of them is someone that is dual diagnosed, that they have several challenges that they have to face. How are you equipped to be able to assess that and then give them the proper placement and care that they need? And that'll be ready for
And if
round.
I can just address part of that. We do have some mental health specialists in our intake centers, but we are not behavioral health specialists, which is why we do partner with the Department of Behavioral Health and Intellectual Disabilities to get additional assessments when necessary. But we do keep some available in our intake centers as
So
well.
since you answered that, I got one more, and that is President Johnson and my staffer, Lena there, went out on Code Blue. And they were out talking to people about coming in. And one of the most disturbing things out of the 30 or so people that they contacted was this, that some of them were reluctant to go into our shelter system out of fear of safety. And they felt safer in jail than they would in a shelter. How are we attacking that?
So thank you, if I can answer that quickly. Our team actually does monitoring of all of our shelters. They monitor for case management, they monitor for the physical qualities, and they monitor for making sure that they meet the standards. If the shelter does not pass the assessment, then there is a corrective action plan that they have to implement. We do then continue to monitor those, and those who are not, we would have up to and subject to termination of that contract. But we've done all of them this year. We've also had our inspectors go out and do some physical inspections as well to make sure that people are in shelters that we would want to be able to have to our standard. And the team has heard me talk several times about the fact that I did have family in our shelters, and they told me about the fact that they would rather be on the street than to be in the shelters. So it is important to me to make sure that the shelters are meeting a certain standard.
Save my rest of questions for round two. Thank you, Mr. President.
You're welcome. The chair recognizes the chair of Housing, Councilman Jamie Gautier.
Thank you, Council President. Thanks to you both for being here, and thanks to you and your whole team for the critical work that you do every day. We really appreciate working with you. As the Majority Leader alluded to, the most recent point-in-time count released in September 2024 reflected a near 40% increase in unhoused individuals. At the same time, the proposed OHS budget is 6% less than the previous year. I've been in conversation with you all about this seeming decrease and have some follow-up questions that I wanted to get on the record. The administration provided my office with a memo explaining that the reduction was not programmatic, but a line item called, quote, funding for unanticipated needs. Can you expound on the intended purpose of this reserve, and does a drastic increase in homelessness count as an unanticipated need? Next, although you said there are no programmatic reductions, I do see an overall $1.3 million reduction in the area of prevention, diversion, and intake. Why does it seem like we're cutting programs while homelessness is going up in the city by really large amounts? Finally, the memo stated that an additional $3.65 million was added to MDO for wellness vouchers, and that would offset any decrease to the OHS budget. Even if we were to consider that money an offset, it's still $1.4 million less than what was available in FY25. And so I want to close this series of questions in the same way that I started. Why are we reducing the OHS budget while homelessness is going up in very concerning ways?
Thank you for that question. So to address the first part of it, as I mentioned in my opening testimony, while the OHS budget did decrease, the services for people experiencing homelessness has increased. As I mentioned, the vouchers, and you mentioned the same vouchers, are through the Managing Director's office, but those will be administered by the Office of Homeless Services. In addition, there were funds that were originally part of the Philly Home at Girard budget that we transitioned and will now be managed by the Managing Director's office. So we have not cut any services in the Office of Homeless Services. Everything that we set out to do has been funded this year.
Respectfully, we've gone over this a lot in meetings, over email. I still do not understand from a pure math and numbers perspective how this is not a cut. Nothing that we've been shown shows that this is not a cut. And at the same time, we have real evidence of homelessness going up. I need to understand this, and I think that all of us need to understand how we're meeting the needs of unhoused individuals while at the same time having less money in the actual budget.
Thank you. So our needs have gone up, and actually our new count is even higher. So I do agree with you that there is a bigger need. However, I will say that I'm seeing a level of collaboration that I did not see when I was a service provider, nor did I see when I first came in. And I will say the Community Wellness Office, as well as the Home Initiative, are two initiatives that will benefit those experiencing homelessness. The Riverview Wellness Center, to enter that one right now, are people experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness, as well as some of the initiatives under the DBH IDS portfolio as well. They've added additional beds too.
If we could pause for just a moment, these are wonderful new programs. They're also very specific. They're for a very specific population, and we all know that to get into Riverview, one has to go to a 30, 60, 90-day program to even be referred to that site. So I don't understand how adding these programs that are very specific to a particular population helps us overall to deal with a 40% increase of people on the street. And I would ask that you follow up with the detail that shows in whatever department you all want to point to and in whatever project you want to point to, how are we going to serve 40% more people on the street with kind of these adjustments that we've made in our budget and in our services?
We can follow up in writing, but I will add lastly that the Philly Home at Girard, while that is not an OHS project, that was 180 new beds that are for people directly off the street. There is no preconditions for entering that. It's a safe haven. It's funded through DBH IDS, but it's solely for people who are coming directly off the street.
I would love to see this comprehensively and to understand not only the numbers, but the full picture of services that are going to get us to where we need to be and allow us to support our people. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Council President.
You're welcome. The chair recognizes Councilmember Jim Harity, Councilman Ruth Landau.
Thank you, Council President. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming down. Thank you, my brother. Can you tell me or tell us which specific populations are being prioritized in the budget? Are there targeted initiatives for veterans, women with children, individuals with disabilities? And then secondly, many individuals, especially women with children, flee abusive situations and may find themselves homeless without affordable housing options. Do we have specific programs for these individuals? And if so, can you explain how these individuals connect to these housing opportunities?
Thank you for that question. So we do have some targeted initiatives. For example, we are trying to ramp up a specific Violence Against Women Act transfer process, so those who may be experiencing some domestic violence issues who need to move quickly and are already experiencing services through us, they'll be able to transfer and relocate to someplace safe. We also fund some programs through Women Against Abuse currently that are specifically for individuals who are experiencing domestic violence. We have shelters that are family specific as well as when we look at some of our prevention and permanent housing support, there are units of all sizes, including those for families.
Okay. How about, just on a follow-up, how about, there's a lot of homeless people who have animals. What's the policy when it comes to that? Because something like that could keep them actually out there. Yeah, I've actually been out there when they were talking to somebody who had a dog and he wasn't able to take his dog, and he said, well, if I can't take the dog, I'm not going nowhere. You know what I mean? It's, you know. So are there any housing opportunities like that?
Yes, so our recent, I will speak specifically to our shelter, our recent RFP that we put out indicated that we are prioritizing shelter, in responses that take in pets, because we do recognize that that is a barrier. All of our sites are required to bring in anyone who has their animal deemed an assist animal or service animal, but we are trying to expand the level of shelters that will allow individuals who bring in pets. So that was our new initiative under the RFP that we just put out.
Huh. Yeah, that's interesting. How do they go about getting the animal listed as like a worker animal, for lack of a better word?
To have the animal qualified, it just takes a qualified professional. It doesn't have to necessarily be a medical professional. It's just someone who's deemed qualified to say whatever the animal services the animal is providing, that animal is able to do that, or that there's a need for it. So they make the nexus between whatever the disability or emotional support is to the individual. That isn't something that we do. It is a qualified professional that does that for the animal. However, anyone who comes in can request a reasonable accommodation, either to the shelter or the intake center that they come into. If they are denied for any reason, we actually have an appeals process that comes directly to our office, so we're not leaving that at the service provider level. The appeals comes to our office for a review, and we put up flyers at all of our sites to make sure that individuals know that they can request that appeal.
Okay, thank you. Did the bell ring? Well, since I'm not. Can you tell me how many shelter beds are available now, and what is our goal for the number of beds for 2026?
So I would have to look up right now our shelter beds, but we have roughly about 90% utilization in our shelters, and we have approximately 3,000 shelter beds. And so on any given day, it averages 90 to 95% occupied on our shelters, but we take a census every day, so that changes every day because people, either may not return or discharge, or they're placed in permanent housing. But we can provide that today's census in writing.
Yeah, that brings up another question. How many people are sitting on waiting lists?
Sitting on waiting list, I'm
Sitting
sorry.
on, if you're only at 90%, so that would be 10% of the people aren't, right?
Yeah, so it's not that there's a waiting list. We have beds available. It's just that we have more beds available than people who have come in to ask for the beds.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
President.
Councilman Ruth Landau, then Councilman Dr. Nina Mott, then Councilman Quetzalcoatl.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you both so much for being here. We appreciate you so much and really appreciate the collaboration that you're doing. I feel like we're on the right trajectory. It feels awesome. I wanted to follow up a little bit on the budget, what we're seeing as a budget cut first and the demand. And my first question is, well, let me say that I did a panel the other night with former state rep Donna Johnson Bullock, who's now run Project Home, and she said to this entire room of small landlords that in Philadelphia, we are basically lucky for having only about 1,000 unhoused people on the street, that similarly situated cities have thousands and thousands more. And it was that moment that I had, gave me a little bit of hope that we could tackle this problem. And I also have concern that our numbers are starting to rise. So I wanted to know what strategies you're utilizing to ensure that we keep our numbers down. And also want to underscore when we talk about the budget that it would be very helpful for us to see a comprehensive chart that not only explains an individual and family going through the shelter process, but also where we're funding other initiatives in the city that are also helping homeless people. For us, we just see this budget being cut. What we want to see is if they put more money in another area to help folks with vouchers or something like that, that it's all inclusive, and that we want to also know who is overseeing all of that. Are you guys like basically the project manager, regardless of where that money is, or is it spread out in a bunch of ways? So I want to hear a bit about that. I also wanted to ask, as somebody who worked at the city of Philadelphia before for many, many years, whether if I had a magic wand and gave you $20 million more right now, would you accept it or would you put it in a different department?
Oh, that's a dangerous question that I think I will pause on for a minute. However, I will say that I do agree homelessness is on the rise, and it is on the rise everywhere. And what we do is we track comparable cities, but also some of the larger cities, like New York has 140,000 people experiencing homelessness right now, so our numbers pale in comparison. However, we are looking to find strategies, which is why we partner with other city departments. Not all of the vouchers are administered by us, but some directly earmark them for the people experiencing homelessness. We also partner with PHA, who has units that are identified just for individuals who are experiencing homelessness. So it does look different when you're looking specifically just at our budget, to your point, which is why I'm similar to the majority leader. We can give you details on how that money is spent and where we see that other departments are supporting it. But I think ultimately, to end homelessness, we need more housing. Like, if I'm just going to be straight with it, there are, between our shelters and our...
Can I have a point of information? Right along the lines of your exact statement. So in terms of the mayor's housing initiative, what's the targeted number of units dedicated to OHS to address the issue of homelessness? We know there's 30,000 units. The goal is to focus on, that's a combination of preservation and built units, but is there a target for specifically those who are in need of housing, who are homeless, a part of that plan? Now I rest my time back. I rest the time back to Councilman Landau.
So thank you for that question. So we have been working with Director Lawrence and Angela Brooks as well to come up with what is the strategy for addressing homelessness. As many of you know, Angela Brooks comes from a supportive housing background, so we've already started having some of those conversations, but the exact number hasn't been identified yet. But what I will say is any housing that's earmarked for people who are 0 to 30% of AMI would ultimately benefit, individuals in our population, because that is the typical area median income that our population falls in. But I will add to that, if you don't mind, that as we work with PHA, one of the things that we have realized is that they have some units, again, as I mentioned, that they want to target for individuals experiencing homelessness. What they've said is they need some wraparound support and dollars for that. So we've looked at our budget and said, well, while we can't financially sustain a rental subsidy, into perpetuity like PHA can, we can look at some of our dollars and be able to provide the support services for those units. So that is some of the models that we're currently looking at, where they're providing the subsidy, and then we're adding some service dollars to that.
I just think it kind of boggles my mind that we're in the process of borrowing $1 billion, $1 billion, and we see there's a housing crisis, but yet we don't have a targeted number in partnership with the Office of Housing Services specifically to produce more units for housing. Is something we have to take a look at prior to this budget being passed. Councilman Landau?
Just to follow up on this line of questioning is really who or what entity is overseeing all of this for the city of Philadelphia? It seems that we don't have a housing plan. We don't have a plan that starts with how do we start eradicating.
We do have a plan. We have a plan in front of us. Could you clarify that, Councilman Landau?
We have a funding plan, but we need to have an actual plan that starts, that goes in every city, single avenue. It starts with how to eradicate homelessness, how to give supportive housing, how to give transitional housing, how to get people into independent homeownership with services if they need it, how to give them all of the services they need, and then leave them in a place where between job readiness and whatnot, they can actually be on their own. But there's funding system and there is no plan. And I'm very concerned about the thought that we have put pockets of money and pockets of vouchers and things in different departments and units, and there is no driving plan of who's overseeing it and making sure it all goes together.
Thank you. If I could add that, again, in partnership with Angela Brooks, we are working with them and discussing, how to prevent in homelessness. It is early on my part to say what the numbers are, because I know that she's still working on the plan. I don't know what day it is that she's been here now, but I am excited that she's here, and I do think she'll be able to come up with a plan that will support ultimately our goal to end street homelessness.
Excellent. We are equally excited that she is here and want to work with her and you and everyone, but this is something that the money has to come with the blueprint, and we will be happy to see that when it's done.
Thank you very much. Councilmember Dr. Nina Ahmad, Councilmember Lozada, then Councilmember O'Roy.
Thank you, Council President. Thank you all for being here and doing this really critical work for our most vulnerable community members. The National Foster Youth Institute reports that child welfare system is sometimes described as a highway to homelessness, with an estimated 20% of young adults who are in care becoming homeless the minute they age out of the system. I wanted to know how you have specifically targeted that population. Do you know what that number is? Do we have a plan in the budget to address that? Because if we can arrest it at that point, we can really go a long way in making sure they never experience homelessness and they are set up for life to prosper.
Thank you for the question. So yes, we do have some programs that are specifically for young adults experiencing homelessness. We have a youth homeless demonstration program that was funded from HUD, where we provided funding to providers that are specifically engaged with young individuals. But in addition, we have staff within our school system that's working with individuals, not just those who are aging out of foster care, but those who may be in families that are experiencing homelessness as well. Our point-in-time count in 2024 showed approximately 355 people who, between the ages of youth and young adult that are experiencing homelessness. So we wanted to come up with strategies, which is why the demonstration program was so important. And we are also looking at that funding and seeing how we can be able to expand some of the services that we're providing specifically to youth and young adults experiencing homelessness.
So to Council President's point, we are allocating $2 billion. And so you still don't have numbers for this small group of people, how they're going, where do they fit in the plan? What are the numbers around it? What is the money being allocated? In our CCP community college testimony, we heard that PHA they have a relationship with PHA for 16 units only, right? Well, that makes no sense. So I want to know that who is in charge, just like my colleague Rulanda was saying, who is the central clearinghouse to say, for this specific population, what is the number, what is the money, when do we need to see it, how are we following them, what are the wraparound services? Because this could save us so much money if we invested now. I just want a plan, and I want a plan with actionable data that tells us this is how we can follow it. So, one year out, you should be able to come back and say, all of these things, this is where we are, this is what we did, this is how much money we invested, and this is the outcome. In all of this stuff you give us, there's none of that.
So thank you.
Very frustrating, I have to tell you.
So if I can clarify, our young adult program is separate from our general fund. We do have some grant funding that we receive specifically for young adults. In FY23, just the third quarter alone, we were able to place 6 young adults in permanent supportive housing, 21 in rapid rehousing. We had approximately 110 exit shelter. We have some that are receiving services. So we are tracking specifically young adults, again, separate from the rest of our programs. And with the access points, we also have access points in centers that are just for people who are age 18 to 24. They can still go to our other centers, but we do have a plan that we are working with, and we work with the service providers that are working with young adults to make sure that there is a plan targeted just for young adults.
So we really should be able to handle this completely. There should be no young adult who's in the foster care system, particularly those aging out, who should have this issue at all. The number is small, it's not massive. In fact, the homeless number is only 1,000 point in count. That's a very manageable number. We are spending so much overhead to solve this problem. I want to really understand, why is it such an intractable issue when we really should be, when we look at the money spent and the actual target problem, why are we having this issue? Why are we not able to crack this nut?
And I think homelessness is a complex issue, period. And when you add the complication of aging out of foster care, I certainly understand, which is why we do partner with DHS. We have both the family unification vouchers and then the foster and youth independence vouchers that we are able to issue to make sure that those that we issue those vouchers to do not enter into homelessness. But could there be more? Absolutely. But we are partnering with the providers like DHS or the departments like DHS to make sure that we have some comprehensive plans to address this issue.
I would love to get a report sent to you to say, what is that comprehensive plan? What does it look like? What is the timing? What is the money? And how are we going to follow outcomes? I would really appreciate that. Thank you.
And we can also provide some of the things that we are funding today to you in writing, just so you can have that. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilwoman Ketsi Lozada, Councilwoman Nicholas O'Rourke.
Thank you, Council President. Thank you for being with us this morning. My questions are similar or along the same lines as some of my colleagues. I recognize that one of your FY26 strategic goals is to strengthen your collaborative partnerships with providers and others. How many providers, or do you know how many providers you have in the Kensington community or the 7th Council District? And of those providers, how has the progress been, or how has the P3 division tracked their progress?
So thank you for the question. We'd have to respond in writing to the question about how many specific providers are in Kensington. And then are you asking about tracking progress of the providers?
Of those providers.
So I can give you some of the monitoring that I spoke of about the shelters and some of those providers. That applies to all of our providers. However, I do want to clarify that our providers are primarily shelter providers. And so we will be able to give you that, and I can give you the monitoring in writing of what we had for those specific shelters that are in Kensington.
Thank you.
That's it?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Councilmember O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning to the entire OHS team. I'd like to start by thanking you for the crucial, the life-sustaining work that you all do. I want to ask about the federal continuum of care funding for permanent supportive housing, which provides long-term subsidized housing for people with disabilities for the listening public. A few weeks ago, our office heard that a number of long-term providers in this space were not receiving renewals for their contracts under this funding stream. We also heard that this was due to an administrative error on the city's part. So my staff took the question to y'all itself, and were told to the contrary that certain Tier 2 contracts were not renewed at HUD's discretion. So I'm seeking clarity within that realm. In these exchanges, my team learned that around $3 million of funding, impacting 250 housing units, was lost due to this particular shift. This means that hundreds of Philadelphians with disabilities will no longer have permanent supportive housing beginning the 1st of July, more than there are already currently without shelter on the streets now. So here's what I'd like to know, and I imagine we'll probably need to get some of this in writing to submit to the president, but I'd like to get them on the record now. Can you please explain how it's possible to all of a sudden lose permanent supportive housing funding like this? It doesn't make sense to me that the money can just evaporate because of a ranking system.
Thank you for that question. So OHS is the collaborative applicant for the entire city of Philadelphia's continuum of care application. During the local application, we are required, as all cities are, to rank the applications 1 to whatever the last application is. There is a certain dollar amount that HUD says is, I hate to say guaranteed in this administration, but you know, in essence, there's a cut on, or there's a dollar amount that they fund, and then everything else is part of a national application. So anything that falls below that tier 2 is what it's called, is subject to the national application or the national competition. So we send in our application, and then we were awarded up to right, I think, about our tier 2 level. So there was those that fell below the tier 2 were cut, as well as there were some new applications that we tried to get in that were not funded. However, I will add that I recognize and the team recognize that there are some ways that we can strengthen our application, because that is part of it, is because we are being ranked with other cities. We want to make sure that we strengthen our application in the future. So that's what we're working on for FY27, because that's when the next application will come in. But in the meantime, what we did through our, for our FY26 funding is we submitted an RFP for those who did lose funding to make sure that no one was put out on the streets July 1st, you know, as long as the provider itself was deemed that there was no other deficiencies in their program. So that application or that RFP just went out.
Yeah.
And again, that is to bridge that program. But I'll also add, we have a permanent supportive housing RFP out too that providers can apply to with the intention of being able to expand our permanent supportive housing. So between the two of those, our goals are not to make sure that no one's held harmless on in a unit, you know, where the program itself is meeting the standards, but also we're still trying to expand our permanent supportive housing. This is a little bit complicated in the fact that these were not city-managed contracts. So even through this application, they are HUD direct, which means they get their funding directly from HUD after the application and the award is announced from HUD. Those are not managed by OHS at all. That's all direct with HUD.
On the RFP point, I did hear about the RFP that you had out to mitigate the impact of loss of funding. Will that RFP be enough to provide housing to all Philadelphians who are losing housing?
Are you saying for the COC?
Say again?
Are you asking specifically for the continuing care?
Yeah, yes, within that realm, yes. Will that RFP be enough to provide housing to all Philadelphians who are losing housing?
It is enough to cover the, or the permanent housing dollars for the programs that, again, were meeting the acceptable standards, so they weren't at the bottom for any issues with the actual housing. And if they applied and they meet all the criteria in the RFP, then, you know, the team will make the assessment at the time. But because it just closed, it's a little challenging, but to address what's happening in the scoring system currently. But I will say we put enough funding in there so that if everyone applied and they meet the criteria, it would cover the housing. Short answer, I guess.
There may be a shortfall. So I heard the bill, and I'll pass it on, but I'd like to request a list of all providers that would be impacted by all of this shortfall, those that aren't fully funded and those seeing their contract terminated, if that's the case, including the number of Philadelphians served by each provider and the district that each provider operates in. I think that would be super helpful for us to know. And I'll come back, if there's another round, I'll come back. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Councilmember Brooks, Councilmember Phillips, and Councilmember Young, then we'll officially be in our second round.
Thank you, Council President. I have one clarifying question. You mentioned the Philly home at Girard, and it's straight from the street. Is that because of the sweeps, or is just when someone goes through? Because how it was set up and how it's running, I'm very confused as to what exactly the Philadelphia home at Girard is. So if we can get, you don't have to explain it now, but if I can have a written explanation kind of go through, Council President, because I'm kind of confused of exactly what's happening at Philly home at Girard. And then my other question was about, we've seen a number of encampment suites over the past year. How many of the people experiencing homelessness that were impacted by the suites, and how many of them are currently in permanent supportive housing?
Thank you for that question again, Councilmember Brooks. In terms of encampments and service coordination, from July 1st of 2024 to April 1st of 2025, we had 1,176 service connection with 2 encampments, which consist of 30-day posting. And in that was at 30th Street Station, where 17 individuals, along with pets, were placed into shelters, and the other one that was in the council member 7th District, where it was at PennDOT at the end of Armango, where 10 people were placed. We don't consider them sweet. We look at this as a deeper engagement because there's multiple service providers that are out there that are providing a wide range of services. Mm-hmm. And to go back to that question, when you mentioned about 2100 Girard, this was an opportunity for outreach teams, housing initiatives people who does service connection to have a direct referral right into those sites. And they were designed for individuals who are living on the street without any prerequisites. As long as they said yes, they were able to go right in.
So how many of those folks that you talked about end up in permanent supportive housing?
I'm sorry,
How many people ended up in permanent supportive housing?
We can get that number directly to you, so I don't want to put out a number that's not accurate at this point.
Okay, and my next question is about, we understand that folks who relapse while at Riverview are being discharged. Has OHS encountered any of these individuals on the streets of Philadelphia who were a part of the wellness ecosystem, but they were discharged? And if you have, how have we handled those cases?
We can get back to you on numbers of people that's coming out of treatment, but just for the record, we work with all service providers, and anybody who goes into any type of housing, whether that's shelter, whether that's treatment, we make sure that our outreach teams, our case management team have that relationship so that they can go back to them if there's any issues there.
Well, I think the question is trying to get around, while people are in the ecosystem, when they come back in the ecosystem, are we tracking them? Because the likelihood they can be back in the system again. We're trying to make sure if people have a transition plan, if they're coming back in our system again, once they're discharged from relapsing after the 90-day treatment, then once you're on the street, you're considered homeless again. They get picked back up. What do we do? I just was trying to understand what the process is.
Thank you, Councilmember Brooks, for the question. Crystal Yates Gale, Deputy Managing Director, Health and Human Services. I will make the answer as clear and succinct as I can because multiple departments touch the wellness ecosystem. Our Executive Director of the Community Wellness and Recovery position does have all of that data. So it is monitored. I don't want to use the word tracked in these days, but people are monitored from beginning of the system to end and connections after they leave the system for whatever reason that is. And we can get you some of that data returned in writing from the managing director's office through council president.
Okay, and one other question is, how many outreaches do you have, and do you intend on having more as we continue to track these systems and as the homeless numbers are outreach workers, yeah?
So outreach is actually managed through the Department of Behavioral Health and Intellectual Disabilities. However, we do have our housing team that is on the streets, and there are two different teams, as well as we have the encampment resolution team that we contract with that works with them, but the actual outreach teams are part of DBH-IDS.
So I think so.
Ma'am, if I can add that in DBH-IDS's budget, which they'll be here on Monday, they have requested additional dollars to add outreach workers to their teams also.
Okay, I'm just trying to figure out this housing plan around ecosystem. Everyone's using these different words, and Dave, you know I've been doing this housing thing for a long time, so I'm just trying to understand what's the system, because I don't understand it anymore. I'm kind of out of the reach on what exactly is happening, who's going where, who's tracking the data, how does people end up in the system, because I've worked with you before in finding a missing person, and it took you like 3 days to find somebody who was sleeping at the airport. So I'm just trying to get to understand what is our current system and model to deal with homelessness, and how are we tracking, or whatever the word we want, how are we keeping in touch with our houseless individuals, whether they're going through treatment or going into supportive housing or just living on the street? If you could give it to me in writing, that would be helpful.
An additional point of information, because I do have a working group on homelessness, right? I think even some of your team or some representative may be at the table, but it's, no, actually not at this moment. This is mainly stakeholders, right? But it's in direct line, my direct line of questioning is piggyback off on what Member Brooks just mentioned. In terms of the system, from my understanding, we don't have a system that shares information amongst the various different service providers, but other states do. And I think we're similar to the HIPAA law that prevents us, but I'm trying to understand, because other states, one agency can talk to another agency in terms of tracking and making sure services are provided in a comprehensive way. So could you elaborate on the actual system off what was just asked as well?
So the system that we use to track the services that are provided is called the HMIS, is what is referring to the Homeless Management Information System. All of the providers that contract with us utilize that system. I do agree one of the challenges with our current model of HMIS is that it is kind of sheltered, provider by provider, so it's not shared across. So we are looking at how we can expand that system so that multiple providers can see what's happening with one person, because similar to you, I've seen other models where the data is shared. We currently have an RFP out for that as well, to change our system so that it can be more comprehensive and bring it into a new way of tracking everyone who comes in. We are not a HIPAA-covered entity. That's the distinction. That's so that our services is not bound by that same restriction. However, we still want to make sure the information is protected, which is why we are trying to bring in a new software system so that we can monitor and see what actual services someone's providing from the moment they enter the shelter system to the moment that they're placed in permanent housing.
Member Brooks?
No, I just need it in writing, because like I said, I'm not clear, and I don't want to have you just talk to me in circles. I'd rather look at it, and then I can ask my questions more directly, because I've been involved. You helped us find people before, so I'm not understanding what's the new system? Is it a new system, or why we can't figure out this information? So I look forward to having a deeper conversation so we can kind of be on the same page, because
Yeah, we can provide that to you in writing. And we can also share the information that's in our current RFP so you can see what type of technical specs we're asking for from the service provider.
Thank you.
Perfect. The chair recognizes Councilmember Phillips and Councilmember Young.
Thank you, Council President. Thank you all for attending today. OHS plans to reduce the length of stay in shelters by piloting new initiatives. What specific barriers currently prevent faster transitions to permanent housing, and how will these new pilots address them differently than past approaches?
Thank you for that. So one of the things that we realize is that we're using an old assessment system that you may have heard it referred to as the VI-SPIDAT. And that is an old system that tracks and assesses and prioritizes individuals who need housing. So we are looking to change that model to make sure that we are addressing everyone who's in the shelter system, because under that model, individuals are given a score, and so someone who just came in may actually get prioritized over someone who's been there for a long time. So we want to look at that and come up with a system that is specific to Philadelphia and addressing the needs that are in Philadelphia. The other thing that we want to do is just make sure that we're monitoring all of the available options for housing that we have. We have the set-asides that we get from the low-income housing tax credit. We have other providers that are providing permanent supportive housing. So we want to make sure that our list is comprehensive, not just from those that we fund, but also those who may have other funding sources, so that when they need someone to go into the unit, that we are also looking at being able to provide those units quickly. Also, we are looking at the fact that there are units that get turned down. And so we want to make sure that we're understanding why those units get turned down. So they actually sit vacant for quite an amount of time. And so is there a way that we can make sure that we know what the participants want, so that we're not referring them to units that they are eventually going to turn down that then stay vacant for a long time?
Okay, thank you. And then I want to ask you this. Philadelphia has one of the highest rates of student homelessness in the state. How is OHS working with the school district to identify and support students experiencing homelessness? And what portion of the FY26 budget is allocated towards youth and student-focused housing intervention?
Thank you for that question. So we have a staff member that works very closely with the school district, along with us working with DHS to work collaborative of tracking those students. It is very unique with students that are unaccompanied, because as you know, most young people under the age of 18 really don't identify as being homeless because of the things that are stereotyped that are with that. And so we're working collaborative with that. We have someone who's at our intake site that works closely with families that have children under the age of, children under the age of 18, that helps track with the school district. But we work closely with Kimberly Ali at DHS to try and understand that population even more. But we can be better in that. What we do with our youth homelessness, which is called Young Adult Leadership Academy, they go out, work with Valley Youth House, Covenant House, and all of them to do outreach to potential kids that are under the age of 18. But we have to get better in that system of tracking and identifying them.
And if I can just add, as I mentioned earlier, we have access points and intake that's specifically for individuals who are under the age of 24, so that we can make sure that they are getting services that they need that are targeted for them as well.
Thank you so much. I'm just looking forward to seeing more of that, and also just in general, I know that a lot of people are curious about what you're going to be doing with people who are on the streets, not only in Center City, but also throughout the city of Philadelphia, and how you engage them to get housed. We're curious about what that looks like, because especially some of our Center City businesses. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Young.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good afternoon. Just a couple questions, just for some clarity or some definitions. Do you guys differentiate between what is someone experiencing homelessness versus someone who is unhoused? Like, is that a distinction that is made between your OHS? Or if not, can you define for us what is your definition, essentially, of homelessness, and who creates that definition?
So we use the HUD definition of homelessness, which has several different categories of individuals that are experiencing homelessness. But I think the distinction that you sometimes hear, especially for unhoused, is because someone in the shelter is still someone who is experiencing homelessness, but they are not in a place that they can lay their head at night. So a lot of times you hear individuals say unhoused. I use them interchangeably, and sheltered, unsheltered, housed, unhoused, but unhoused usually includes a lot of individuals. But ultimately, when we are making our definitions, because we want to make sure we're always using the correct ones, we use HUD's definition of homelessness as well as the qualified populations that are there, and usually is people who do not have a permanent location to lay their head at night, as well as individuals who may be at risk of homelessness is a category, and then formerly homeless is a category, which are people who do not have a permanent location to sleep at night.
I ask that because to access your shelter services, right, you don't allow folks who are couch surfing to have access to those systems, essentially, to have access to the housing resources to get transitional housing and things like that. You have to go through the shelter system is what I'm being told. And so if you have a definition that includes those people who are couch surfing, who don't have a permanent place to live, I was like, how come they don't have access to the same level of services that someone who is living on the street does?
So there are different types of services. We have prevention services that are there for people to prevent them from being homeless, and that could qualify for someone
they're couch surfing, right? They are homeless. They don't have a permanent place to live, right? So that's the population that I'm talking about.
So we don't turn away anyone from our services. Let me say that clearly first. But however, there are certain populations that qualify for different housing depending on what their current homeless status is or their current status is. Couch surfing by HUD definition is not considered homeless. So especially when we are providing housing that is funded by HUD, we have to use HUD's definitions of homeless. However, there are some housing models, and unfortunately I don't have them in front of you, and perhaps we can find the ones, even though I don't know if I can find the ones that are not funded by the city. However, I want to say that some funding is for people who are at risk of homelessness, and couch surfing is one of those categories that are considered at risk of homeless. However, someone having a place to go, while it may not be the house that they own, in HUD's eyes, they consider that a different category than someone who is, but for the shelter, would be on the street that night.
If you don't mind, if you can share with us those definitions specifically from HUD, because in one instance you said someone that lacks permanent housing is homeless. And if I'm couch surfing, I lack permanent housing, but then you say, well, I don't qualify. They don't meet the definition under HUD standards. So I'm just trying to get clarity on what is considered to be someone who is homeless. So as constituents call us, I know how to direct them to the appropriate resources that they may be eligible for or not eligible for.
We can put it in writing. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just had a question in terms of the leadership team. How often do you go out yourselves and inspect our shelter facilities? Not sending out an inspector, and I'm asking this question to follow up with Member Jones's line of questioning and statements that when we did a point in time, it was super freezing cold, and so I don't even know why I voted to banish the Pooh Shiesty ski mask, because it was very cold that night, and I could have used it appropriately for what it was supposed to be used for, because it was that cold, right? And talking to different individuals, and we did, like myself, met a couple of different individuals who talked about they preferred to stay outside, right, than to be inside some of the shelters. And some talked about staff as well as individuals who were being housed there, right? And so I just want to get an idea, how often do you as a team go out and inspect the facilities? And then also, when it comes to health, do we provide health-related support staff, nurses assistants on the sites for those who may be in need?
Thank you. So for the first question, I think I'm in month 8 I'm not sure what month I am, but however, I've been out to several of the shelters, as well as Dave goes out to the shelters. Sometimes our staff goes out announced, sometimes it goes out unannounced, because as we know, an announced visit, everybody shines the silver, right? So our goal is to make sure that we are visiting the shelters. I've been out to several of them so far, and I plan to go out to all of them. They all know that I plan to visit, as well as Dave, and the housing team goes out on a regular basis to visit as well. When we get complaints, we do unannounced visits because we want to see, again, what the participants see at the moment that they are concerned about something. So part of our monitoring is to make sure that not only the direct monitoring staff goes out, but eventually all of us go out as well.
Chair recognizes Majority Leader Gilmore Richardson.
And please don't take me out of the queue because I've been patiently waiting.
Gotcha.
I'll put that on the
See
record.
that.
I think I was number one for round two.
See
so I'll
that.
put that on the record. No, you just mentioned the complaints. When you receive complaints, you do unannounced visits.
Yes.
But do you all do proactive visits?
Yes.
Right? Mm-hmm. Okay, I just wanted to make that clarification. Okay, you will, because, and I only said that because of the Boots on the Ground, which I love that name because it's all the rave line dance with the corrective action plans. Mm-hmm. So as a part of that, you all were supposed to be improving the monitoring and the evaluation of the emergency shelter providers. So if you could, to Council President's question, I just wanted to put it on the record that you all are doing proactive inspections, but you're also doing complaint-driven, what we would call reactive inspections. And I would say to Council President's question, if you could just give a layout of the corrective action plan, like the Boots on the Ground program.
Sure, and they go out without their fans, unfortunately, so they can't do that part of Boots on the Ground. But this year, our team has gone out to 28 sites. They go out twice a year is their goal. That's separate from the unannounced visits. They are looking at case management. They're just doing a general site visit, and then they're looking at the standards, especially if it has different funding sources. We went out to all of them. We have the data on which ones passed, which ones failed, which ones are pending. If they fail, they have to come up with a corrective action plan. Now, depending on the severity of why they failed, some of those corrections need to happen a lot faster than others. We then will send out additional team, or the team will go back and follow up. In some cases, we've sent out our inspectors that normally do our housing quality inspections to go look at the physical building to see what is missing or what needs to be repaired in those buildings, and then they will do a follow-up as well. But when in the cases of the complaints, that is when the team will go out and do an unannounced visit, and they'll see whatever staff is currently there and be able to ask questions and address things, including sometimes the fact that the staff that was supposed to be there may not be there. And so then they're addressing that directly with the provider.
Okay, and I'll probably do, two small brief questions. One, you talked about piloting new initiatives to accelerate transition from shelter to permanent housing. So I just wanted to give an idea, the details of the pilot programs, which I think is great, helping individuals become homeowners or have permanent housing. I think that's excellent. And then also, what are we doing around addressing housing for those who have disabilities?
Thank you. So currently we have, and I'll address the second question first, we have a consultant that's going out to all of our shelters to do an assessment of the accessibility standards for those shelters. And with that, they are identifying both physical modifications as well as program modifications that may be able to happen in those shelters. And some of them are simply things that just need to be repaired, like cracks in the sidewalk or making sure the ramp is up to standards. Others are changes that need to happen, as in changing a paint color for wayfinding for someone who may not be able to distinguish what's happening there, or lowering some of the soap dispensers so that someone in a wheelchair can have access to it. But in addition, as I mentioned before, our reasonable accommodation process has been updated so that if someone does not get the accommodation that they requested, that they can request an appeal directly to OHS, and that we will monitor that and then ultimately give a decision. We are trying to get that word out because so far, even though we've had that operational for the past few months, we have not received any appeals, and just because I've been doing accommodation work for a long time, I expected to see some appeals, so we put out flyers. We're trying to make sure that everybody knows that in the event that they need to get an accommodation and they're not getting the accommodation that they need, they can request an appeal with OHS directly. And then the
Permanent Housing Pilot Initiative.
Yeah, so we are looking at different models to be able to try to get individuals in quickly. As I mentioned before, one of them is looking at our assessment so that we can make sure that we are placing individuals quickly into the housing that's sitting there, because as I mentioned, especially some of the smaller units tend to stay vacant a lot longer because people are holding out for the one bedroom or, some bigger unit. So one of the pilots that we were looking at is, do we change the strategy and just, make sure that everyone is getting referred to those smaller units first so that we can get them filled. If people know that they can hold out for a bigger unit, then we have those units stay vacant. But the other part of that model that we are looking at is, do we find out the criteria that the individual wants? Do they need something with no stairs? Do they need, something in a particular side of town because maybe that's where their doctors are, so that we can then make sure that they're getting referred to those units. But as part of that strategic plan that we talked about earlier in bringing the service provider community in, we really want to have that conversation about what are we missing? Because one thing that I used to see when I was on the provider side, it would take several referrals to find somebody who wanted the unit. And a lot of times we were waving our hand like, we know somebody who wants the unit, just let them move in. They meet all the criteria, we just want them to move in. So rather than just refer people to places they're gonna turn down, let's turn it on its head and do an assessment so that people are getting referred to the units that we know that they will accept.
Now, when a person comes, they're looking for housing, in certain instances, we will get them a voucher, correct? The kind of system to help them with like the rent, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do we do an assessment of the people who the renters are renting off of? That would be the landlords, correct, right? Do we assess them in terms of, are they, because they're accepting the voucher that we're providing the renter?
Mm-hmm.
The person 9 times, well, in my case, I'm speaking of a case scenario where an individual was disabled, right? They got the assistance for the down payment so they could move in, right? But the landlords weren't up to par, right? They basically were they were slumlords. I mean, to be quite frank with you. Do we evaluate the folks who benefit from the voucher money that we give, the renters, to hold them accountable to make sure that who we're supporting are still being treated with a level of dignity in terms of the housing that they're going into? Because
Yes,
some of it is private too, right? Well, I
Absolutely.
know a private situation specifically, but I'm talking about on the grand scheme of things to hold those folks accountable. It's kind of like PHA with Section 8,
Mhm.
right? But in this case, I'm speaking of an individual who had disability, right? But there's other cases where they get support from us through OHS to move in
Yes.
a home
Thank you for that.
or to
So
rent a home, yes.
part of our landlord gateway program is designed to not only recruit landlords who will work with our population, but also help monitor. And in fact, we met with some of the providers yesterday, and they talked about some of those landlords, and that's exactly what the team said. We need to know who they are so that we can address that, and that's part of the complication. We want to make sure that individuals are telling us about those individuals who are not meeting the standard. In addition, though, depending on the program, we have our inspectors go out before we provide the subsidy to make sure that the unit is up to par. But ultimately, we also rely on the providers that we are giving the funding to manage the rapid rehousing program or whichever voucher it may be, to make sure that they're keeping up with those landlords and keeping up the standard. But that is our goal, is to make sure that we're tracking what's happening with those landlords. We, can pull them off of our website where those landlords are identified for people with our subsidies so that they can provide housing. But, we are trying to make sure that we are getting the information, which is why we were expressing yesterday in a meeting with the providers, or on Wednesday with the providers, that we need to know who they are if they're not holding up to their end of it. But we are also having a landlord week conference in May 19th to 23rd, if anybody's interested, where we are trying to educate landlords, but also educate the community and the providers as well on what it means to be a landlord in our program, what are some of the needs. And so there's a variety of different topics that we are trying to address, including making sure that our quality is up. It is in a variety of different places in the city, but we'll be able to get you that in writing as well.
And my last question, as I turn it over to my colleagues for round two, what's your rubric to make sure that equal distribution of the housing funds in terms of how it's distributed equitably across the board? You have some groups that are smaller, right? Then you have the bigger organizations. How do you make sure that it's equitable across the board?
So one of the things—
I have the Otley House in my district, right? I have the Otley House in my district. So that's like one of the semi-bigger ones. And then you have smaller ones in between. So give me an idea, how do you handle that?
So one of the things that we have really been intentional about this year is our RFP process. So during the RFP process, we have a variety of different sizes of providers that apply, and the team looks at that, including the smaller providers, and is making sure that we can provide support to those that we award the funding to. But that is something that is ongoing and continuing to make sure that we are equitable. And you guys probably heard me say that several times, in my opening testimony, to make sure that we have an equitable process. So it's not just all of the larger ones that are getting the funding, but that there are other smaller nonprofits that have the funding source. But part of that is also the technical assistance to make sure that the smaller providers understand the funding source that they're asking for. Some of them, especially the HUD funding, requires a lot of pre-work in order to get the funding, and that does become cost prohibitive to some of the providers, or they may apply for a certain type of funding, not realizing that their housing unit is not eligible for it. So we're trying to look at processes to do training on the front end so that anybody who's interested in getting into this space, they will understand the service, the grants, or the funding source, what is required, if there's an environmental review that's required, or if it can take a tenant-based voucher versus a project-based voucher. All of that requires education for those who may not be in this or don't have a huge administrative team to figure it out for them. And so we are looking at ways through our RFP process to be able to educate more.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes Majority Leader Gilmore Richardson, then Councilmember Curtis Jones Jr., then Councilman Jamie Gauthier, Chair of Housing.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Council President. I wanted to go back to the question quickly that Council President asked regarding sort of the inspections and the corrective action plans that we know were put in place after last year. If you all could just detail for the record how many of the emergency shelter providers have been through that initiative or that program, how many of them remain, and then how did you sort of decide the order of evaluation or order of inspection, so to speak, and how many providers were placed on corrective action plans? How many providers have been recommended for non-renewal based on lack of cooperation with the corrective action plan? And how many providers are at risk for potential non-renewal based on lack of cooperation or other issues relative to the corrective action plans?
Thank you. So we have monitored 28 shelters to date, and of those, initially 12 failed, and we have 13 that are still, 12 failed on the case management, let me clarify. 11 failed on site visits, meaning the team went out and looked at some things, and then 4 failed on on meeting the shelter standards, our policies. Of those, we still have 3 that are pending, meaning they're still under their corrective action plan as far as their failure during the site visit, and 13 are still under a corrective action plan as a result of their meeting the standards.
So let me ask you this question, because I want to put this on the record, because I do think it's important, because there's a couple of sort of trends that I've been seeing here overall in the detail that I have additional questions regarding, even down to the U.S. facilities contract, as well as Scotland Yard's contract, because there are noticeable decreases, right? And if we need to increase services, I'll delve into that on a next round, but I wanted to know if you all have like a mandatory line item for the providers around like maintenance budget, ensuring that folks could address, the concerns really on the front end. If you could talk about if that's included and if you all are addressing that. And I bring that up because of specifically what I've been seeing even with the U.S. facilities contract.
Yes, thank you. And Dave will address the U.S. facilities, but if I can just speak to the maintenance, one of the things that we've been doing is looking at what people are budgeting for and why, and there is a variety of budget amounts that have been submitted on maintenance. Part of what you saw in our current budget about one-time maintenance costs was to address, or is to address that. So we are...
But I apologize for the interruption, but will you all have like a line item for that so that it's clear, meaning that it's not so many additional one-time allocations, because those are very hard to track and you know that there is a need. That came up earlier, even when I notated where you all have under emergency and temporary housing, you have the provider wage increases notated as a one-time expense as well. But will we need to maintain those higher levels over fiscal year 26 and beyond? So are you building those in to the increased payments that 23 of the 33 listed vendors are receiving? Or is that the reason why it's only listed as a one-time and then you're going to build it in moving forward? Because, and I asked that because remember last year we had the 16.1. We went back and forth on that 16.1, and remember we had submitted the additional letter to you all sort of detailing the discrepancies within a variety of the contract documents from last year. And I bring that up because I don't want to be in a circumstance where we're setting ourselves up to do it again because we're just not budgeting, and allocating correctly where we can follow the numbers on the budget detail. So I just want to give you this example, which may help sort of underscore this more. So we compared last year's materials to this year's materials, and is number discrepancy, right? And so as an example, if you look at the increases and decreases detail portion of the detail, like Bethesda project, they were listed as $1,354,894 increase. But under the contracts page for 29 on the FY26 detail, it shows a decrease of $530,955 from FY24 to 25. Same thing even with New Journey CDC. Total $1,499,002 across 2 contracts for FY24, but they were listed as having a $706,967 increase in the FY25 increases and decreases page, but they actually really only saw a decrease of $46,329, and that was after they ended the migrant shelter funds. And there was a decrease in their general shelter contract. So I ask all of that, the one-timers versus if you're putting it inside of the actual contracts movement, because we need to be able to follow those dollars because, again, we know homelessness, right, is on the rise, but we need to be able to keep track of what we have so that we know how much more we, can do, need to do. Like everything is not, meaning the numbers aren't matching up.
Understood. So if I could address the first part about the wage increase, that one-time wage increase is in there because it was not in their original FY25 budgets. However, our FY26 budget does include that for the providers. And so that's part, yes.
We told y'all that was gonna happen.
I'm sorry?
We told y'all that was gonna happen. For the FY '25? Yeah.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason that we want to make sure that it was addressed and put in the budget. So it's called out in there specifically because we want to make it clear that we are increasing the budgets for FY '25. It's embedded in our FY '26 budgets, and so that's why you don't see it called out as a separate line, but that was intentional to make sure that we are covering that this year, and then we also have a plan to cover it next year.
No, and I understand that, but again, with what we see now, we have to be able to track it. That's the challenge, is that we're not able to track it effectively to ensure that everything that we have received matches up. I mean, we told you guys that was gonna happen.
Yep.
So we need to figure out how we prevent that from happening in the future so that we're not in a circumstance where just because the information is not correct, now we're back at a circumstance where at the end of the day, we would have to allocate additional money to no fault of our own, right? You understand what I'm saying?
And what we did was looked at all of the providers, what their current funding amount was for their budgets, and then be able to come up with the numbers so we can be able to provide additional detail on that. Now, as far as some of the contracts that are decreasing that you identified, some of it's a combination of things. Some of them, the contract actually ended this fiscal year, so those are now being RFP'd. So we removed it on our FY '26 budget from whatever the contract is that is ending, and then put it, you will see a line that says TBD, and that is for the ones that are currently out for RFP. We want to make it clear which ones were ending, and then which ones were RFPing. Now, if they're awarded or whoever is awarded that, our budget then will reflect those awards, but currently they're listed in one lump sum for all of the providers that receive decreases in those lines because of their contracts ending this fiscal year.
Sure. With the embedding that's happening and with the additional discrepancy that, like I said, we knew would happen because of the detail and then the contracts from last year, how are you all, one, avoiding that from happening again in the future? But two, I don't know how you're able to move. Is it that other contracts are decreasing enough for you to, in the same class and under the same unit, you're able to move money around? Meaning, where's the extra money coming from?
Are you referring to the wage increases, or I just want to make sure I'm clear?
The one-time allotments, the wage increases, the differences in the emergency and temporary housing shelter contracts. Where is that money coming from? Because I'm only asking because we weren't asked, and I'm vice chair of groups, we weren't asked to move anything around for OHS this year.
So I will just jump in here. I remember sitting here with you last year and promising you that we would not ask for more money.
Right.
So OHS, Finance, Budget, and MDO literally meet every Wednesday to go through OHS's budget needs every week. And at the we're close to the end of the year, there are funds that we can help providers to do the wage increase. We can help providers that are at risk. We do have providers that are at risk for termination of their contract because of the quality issues. So we have an opportunity to help the providers with that one-time maintenance cost. And then for the budget line item, Cheryl said that we are going to look at what the providers submit and their budgets that they submit to us. They are not consistent across the board in how much they request in their budget for maintenance.
Okay.
So we're trying to do some education with them as well.
Okay.
But the 25 costs are that, just us making sure we're not coming back to you for more money and knowing that homelessness is a real problem. So Councilmember Gaudier has said to us, why, if you have extra money, why aren't you using it? Mm-hmm. So we went right to the table and talked to budget to say, we think that that's true. Like, we need to use this money that currently exists to provide those assistance to the providers that are there.
Okay, so the maintenance line items will be embedded moving forward.
the maintenance line item will be embedded into the provider's budgets they submit to us. So it won't, you'll see contract changes to the provider lines, but there won't be a single maintenance line from OHS.
Understood. Okay, thank you. I'll come back on the next round. Thank you, Council President.
Thank you, Madam Leader. Councilmember Curtis Jones and Councilman Jamie Gautier.
Thank you, Mr. President. On your impromptu inspections, I'd like to volunteer me and Member Harity to go undercover, to go undercover. And if you can get us through the paperwork, I trust him to go in with you. Maybe you'll work too, but definitely, Harry, and I'm serious, we will impromptu volunteer to do that. If you would have done that chart that I mentioned early as homework, a third of your questions would have been like self-explanatory, not Majority Leader's questions because they were very financial, but the process of this would have been a little more understandable. So I'm gonna urge you to, when you on the callback, please do that. I wanna focus on particular populations. I'd like to talk about returning citizens, people coming home from incarceration, how they are infused into the system, and older males. We had a situation in my office, a man who grew up in Winfield, and he found, he went the course of, I live with my mom's no longer with us, I no longer can afford this house, it's a big house. They sold it, he wound up in your care. I mention him because that is becoming more and more prevalent, that folk that did not take the precautions to, at a certain point in their life, be self-sufficient are a growing population of folk there. So I want to know, how are we treating ex-offenders, that process, and older males that are kind of finding themselves at the last resort coming to you? And at the end of the day, this individual from Winfield, and the president knows about Winfield, has traveled up there a lot. You helped him, and you've always been helpful. But when the help came, it was in an area, another part of my district, and when he's used to Winfield, that reality, he started breaking out crying. Like literally, like, how did my life wind up here? So how are we addressing that?
Thank you. So to answer the first question about ex-offenders, our housing, or at least the majority of our housing, does not have a criminal history restriction with the exception of sex offenders. So with that, anyone who comes in with criminal history should be able to come, especially in the continuum of care housing that we have. So they can come in, come to our intake centers, get the assessment, and then upon placement, we work very closely with the providers to make sure that there aren't any or very minimal barriers to entry into the housing, depending on the needs, and again, with the exception of a few cases of certain criminal charges, that is the case. Now, as far as individuals who may be experiencing homelessness for the first time, that's part of the reason that we are looking to make our prevention program a little bit more streamlined, because the goal of prevention is to prevent someone from entering homelessness. So we have the program that we partner with, the various city providers in order to be able to provide some additional dollars. We work with the eviction diversion program. We provide some rental arrears assistance. We also provide some security deposit or maybe a couple months of rent assistance so that someone can get the jump start they need to be able to get housing without experiencing homelessness. So those are just a couple of the ways that we're trying to enhance our programs.
Off the top of your head, what's the population of senior males coming into that system, percentage?
I don't have it off the top of my head, but
If you define, how we define senior males, well, seniors in general, 55 and older, I know, we're seeing at least between about 18 to 22% of people who are in that age category that's coming in. Again.
And is it growing?
Yes, homelessness overall.
So just to give you clarity, our shelter on Wednesday had 76 people in it that were 65 and older.
So,
And that was just on Wednesday.
and that's 65.
We didn't do the
Work's ready to
55
go
'cause I'm
undercover.
closer to that too.
Council President, I do want to go back to Majority Leader to answer a question that we did not, and you mentioned about U.S. Facility and Scotland Yard. So first of all, let me just say thank you for your advocacy and just holding us accountable for everybody tax dollars. That's the right thing to do. So as we relate to U.S. Facility, what we did in trying to be fiscal prudent, we know U.S. Facility was causing significant, they do great work, let me just say that, but it's a very expensive contract. And so what we did was reduce that contract to hire more city staff, labor staff, to do maintenance in our shelters. And so when you see that number reduced at 2100 Rod, that was a direct result of us being able to hire about 12 custodial workers at that time, $240,000. That saved tremendous amount of money from where the U.S. Facility contract was. Same thing with Scotland Yard. We were paying, previous to Cheryl coming on, we had Scotland Yard security doing security on Kensington Avenue. As a result of Mayor Parker and other initiatives, there were other resources that could have been allocated there, which was Philadelphia Police. And so we decided to reduce that contract and spend that money other places because there were adequate police resources on Kensington Avenue that we did not need to spend out of a homeless services budget. Yeah.
Possible.
Point of information, Majority Leader Richardson.
Yes, thank you very
Briefly,
much,
please.
Council President. If possible, I will still submit the questions that I have. That makes sense.
Yeah.
I will still submit the questions I have specifically for those two contracts
Yep.
because of the changes in the numbers, but that clarifies
Yep.
partially what we were seeing. And even in the changes in the Class 100 allocations, there was a bunch of different changes there where it was noticeable decreases in the lower level positions. Thank you, Council President.
You're welcome. Councilman Jamie Gautier, then Councilmember Nicholas O'Rourke, then Councilman Rue Landau.
Thank you, Council President. Before I get into my questions, I just wanted to respond to something that I heard. When you're on this floor, you'll hear different themes come up, especially from different council members. Majority Leader is always going to be the fiscal hawk. Councilmember Ahmad is always going to ask about data. I'm always pushing for services. And Councilmember Jones always talks about balance. So I'm going to reach for Councilmember Jones in this moment. I'm hopeful that we can find balance with what we're doing here. I greatly appreciate the focus on fiscal responsibility. We absolutely have to be responsible with tax dollars, and that's the right thing to do. But it really startled me to hear you say that you promised not to come to us to ask for any more money. I believe that while we're being fiscally responsible, one thing that we should not be shy about is spending on unhoused people. We spend so much on so many things in this city. Every single year, I go to the homeless Memorial Day, and we read off a really long list of people who died in homelessness. And it's one of the most heartbreaking events that I attend on an annual basis. And I go every year, and I'll continue to go every year, but I'm hopeful that we don't have that event at some point. And so I want us to achieve the balance of fiscal controls, but also to spend whatever we need to spend to house people in the city of Philadelphia. And
Can I just have a, Council President, a point of clarification? I want to have a point of clarification because what we were directly referring to was the 16.1 million. It was not the overall OHS budget. We were referring to the 16.1 that was in question from last year to say, don't come back after we give you this 16.1 because we had settled on an amount that they needed that we agreed upon for last year. So I don't know that that is indicative of what we have been in discussion regarding, because you know that in council, we've done an extra $41 million since FY18 for homeless services. So when they ask, we do. That was specific to the issue around the fiscal concerns around the contracts, where we allocated the additional money in appropriation for the last year. I just want to be clear. on that
Thank
because
you.
that was-
That's true.
okay.
I almost jumped out of my chair when I heard that.
Thank you for that, Majority Leader, but that's true. We always need more money. We know that homelessness is increasing, and we hope and pray that it doesn't continue, but we think it will in this time of uncertainty. So more than likely, we will ask for more every year, but that was in relation to the $16.1 million.
Thank you for the clarification. On to my questions. The city typically maintains about 3,600 year-round shelter beds and adds roughly 250 to 300 extra beds during the winter code blue cold weather emergencies. What operational or budgetary changes would it take to keep those additional code blue beds available year-round? For example, additional staffing, extended provider contracts, or facility costs? And has OHS considered this expansion? And next, has the Office of Homeless Services estimated the cost of providing these winter overflow beds on a year-round basis? And does the FY26 proposed budget allocate any funding toward expanding year-round emergency shelter capacity or piloting a year-round model for cold weather beds? And I really started to focus on this issue due to what I was seeing in my district. As an example, we have an emergency shelter for women, and I was getting quite a lot of complaints from residents that they would see women lining up outside this shelter, which doesn't open until, I believe, 5 p.m., women lining up as early as noon, all of their things, standing on the sidewalk, because that's how they can ensure they're going to get a bed for the night, that they have to leave at, I think, at 6 a.m. And when I started to talk to the shelter staff about this, they said, well, we don't see this in the winter as much because we have the beds that we need. But once that supply gets cut, then we're back to the same situation of people trying to ensure a bed by standing outside for hours. And my residents were complaining about this, not because they find it unsightly or inconvenient, they find it inhumane. And so I wanted to ask, have we thought seriously about this as a solution?
Yes, thank you. So to keep the winter beds online, we have calculated the numbers. It's approximately $6.1 million extra a year to keep those beds that we have during the winter year-round. We also are looking at ways to stretch those dollars a little bit more, you know, between the enhanced code blue and our winter dollars. We're looking to see if there's a model that does add dignity to that, so that, because I agree, lining up, you know, to hope for a bed is not dignified. So we are looking to see how we can do something different with that. But the reality is that's about the budget, to make sure that the beds that we have during the winter can expand. But we have been looking for different ways to see how we can stretch that. What we did this year with our RFPs, rather than have everyone come up with an operating budget, we came up with a per bed per diem. And that enabled us to add additional beds, you know, and still cover the cost that the providers had for the shelters during the winter. So we're looking at different models to be able to add additional beds during the winter in particular, but, you know, even outside of the winter.
Does the FY26 budget account for this at all, having these beds online year-round in a way that opens up, keeps supply open?
Not currently for the winter beds, no.
Thank you. If you could get your, I'm not sure, I know we asked for this. If you haven't provided that to my office, if you can get that, both the full cost and the sort of per bed cost, we would be appreciative.
Yes, we provided the winter cost, but we can get you the per bed cost.
Thank you very much. Yes. Thank you, Council President.
Thank you, Councilmember O'Rourke, then Councilmember Young, and Councilmember Hardy.
Thank you, Mr. President. While homelessness is a complex problem and the reasons for for each specific instance of homelessness may vary, your clarity stood out to me on what was necessary to solve homelessness, and that being more housing. if there are only currently about 75-ish, I think is what you said, senior men, I would venture to guess they're probably black, who are not housed, it just emphasizes to me in my mind why, and I appreciate Council President and other members of this body emphasizing what the Catholic social tradition calls the preferential option for the poor, that as opposed to us finding all of the reasons to incentivize housing, commodify housing, what have you, that we need to hyper-focus on the least of these. And I just want to just put that on the record. It's just heartbreaking to me that we have this problem and we just cannot figure out how to solve it. I know that the idea is to limit it or what have you, but I think that's a thing that can be resolved. That's not my question. I just needed to get that off my chest. You mentioned FY27 in your responses to my questions in the first round, which makes me feel a little better that though we aren't finished with hearings for FY26, I'm good to look ahead. Each budget season is hard, but if trends in DC continue, then I imagine next year's process will be, frankly, incredibly painful. And on this inauspicious morning, the president is sharing his budget in brief with Congress. In that document, the details aren't out yet, but the reporting notes that the document calls for federal block grants to be eliminated or consolidated and envisions significant cuts to HUD, and we already know the feds want to have HUD's workforce. Meanwhile, your testimony at the back ends by stating that any reductions in federal funding would have a significant impact across the office. Not small reductions, not medium reductions, any reductions would deeply impact your work. So I have some broader questions meant to do some municipal forecasting, meant to kind of forecast in light of FY27. I heard the bell, so I'll try to get them out real quick. I know this is broad funding across a range of grant programs, but let's say the office received 10% less federal dollars next year. What would be some of the services that would be first on the chopping block for OHS? 2, I want to ask about the community development block grants, which this federal administration seems ready to slash. How might any cuts to CDBG impact OHS services, and specifically some of the home initiative programs that have CDBG dollars baked in? Specifically there, is there a clear prioritization of where CDBG dollars will go in the case of cuts?
Thank you. And if I can clarify about the FY27 statement, HUD now has an every other year application process. So when I mention FY27, it's because that's the next time we can apply for that housing or for that funding. So to answer your question about the federal funding, obviously a lot of our services dollars, not just directly through OHS, but also as we apply for that impacts other service providers, will have a huge impact on those experiencing homelessness. Our COC funding is, roughly $50–60 million. That's just about providing housing. So that would have an impact, and you add on to it all the other federal funding that the city has. So it's something we think about, and we thought about it when, they shut down their system and we couldn't get the funding out for a couple of days, and what we were going to do during that time. We worked closely with the law department and the finance department to look at the grant agreements that they're sending to us and whether or not we even should sign them, just given some of the language that they've changed in there. So we defer to law a lot on some of that, but it is a risk. And, that's why every time we get information from the federal government, we are reaching out to finance, we are reaching out to law just to see what our risk exposure is and also what can happen in the event that some of that funding goes away. But it's compounded more than even some of the grants that you mentioned, again, between the service provider community and OHS itself, it would be devastating, just to be honest.
Could you say which services that would actually be first in the chopping block?
It would depend on the funding source because some of them are very specific on how we use that funding. So for example, our COC funding is about the permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing. So if they cut that, then we would lose some of the units that we currently have. Other funding that they give us is specifically about the planning for the city and how we are going to implement the services. So if they cut that funding, then that limits that. Some of our staff is actually paid for out of some of those grants. So if they cut that, we will lose some of our staff, or we'd have to reevaluate how we staff those positions. So it's a little bit complex because each of them fund a different thing, but I just want to give you a few examples.
Thank you for those examples. Mr. President, I'd like to request a CDBG funding priority list jointly crafted between OHS and the leaders of the Home Initiative, naming the programs that our administration sees as most in need of these dollars. I think council needs to know how the admin is thinking about weathering the storm that is clearly on the horizon. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Councilmember Harity. Oh, it was you, Rue? I'm sorry. Rue Landau, then Harity. I'm sorry.
I just, quick, if I could just get a list of all shelter providers, contracted
Member
and
Harity,
city.
speak in the microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Please.
I'm sorry, Council President.
Sorry.
Real quick, and you can get it to me. I don't need it now. Just a list of all the sites contracted or city-run.
Yes, we can
Okay?
get you that list.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilman Rue Landau, then Councilman Lozada, Councilmember Young.
Thank you. At our last Housing Committee hearing, we had a witness, a community navigator, testify that he often didn't know where to send people who needed rental assistance. As of yesterday, PhillyTenant.org indicates that OHS has no funding available for rental assistance and has not had such funding since January 8th, 2025. Is that correct?
That is not correct. Now, during January, it is true that we paused accepting new applications because at the time we had the 4,000 applications that we had to sift through. But once they were able to go through those and determine which ones were eligible, which ones may have resolved in another way, we then reopened our application process. So it's now open. We are accepting applications. But again, as we talked about, or as I was alluding to earlier, we tried to streamline the process. So before people came in, they told us what they needed, we told them what we needed, and then they went back and got it. Now we actually give the information up front and says, if you need assistance, here are all the documents we want you to bring in when you come so that we can do some of that analysis at the moment that the person enters our office.
How can outsiders get the information that they need to know when you have the funds and when you don't have the funds, if this is on a kind of cyclical, seasonal basis?
We are hoping that it's not seasonal. However, what we are trying to do is use technology to monitor and be able to process applications in a different way. We've looked at changing our phone system because people call and they leave voicemails right now. So we're looking to use, different technology within our phone system to be able to let people know. When we did have to temporarily pause, we posted it everywhere. We sent it to our mailing list, and they absolutely can join our mailing list to get information on any services that we provide so that we can keep individuals informed. Anytime you email ohs@phila.gov, it actually gives the information, including our prevention information. And at the time that we had to pause, it also said on that auto response that there was a temporary pause. So we're trying to make sure we're getting the information out as quickly as possible when there are changes.
I'm just as concerned, if you're going to send information out about a pause, then you're going to have to send information out about it's restarting again.
Absolutely.
Let's just try to make sure there's funding year-round so we won't have to do any of that. I wanted to get back to the technology question, though, because I know I've talked to you guys about this before. I am the chair of the technology committee, and it seems that you are one of the departments that desperately needs more technology in order to be able to run your very complicated business you're running. Between your phones and a database that will help us not just track humans, but track open beds, maintenance requests, other concerns that are happening, and making sure that we have a holistic view of beds that are available, families who need them, and you guys can be the Craigslist, Match.com of making sure that we are giving people the unit available for what they need. How far along are you in this request process or in this production process of technology, and is it funded?
So currently, we have the RFP out for our HMIS system. And in those specs, we are asking for a lot more innovation than what we currently have in our HMIS system. So we are looking to enhance that. There are systems that will track individuals. It'll track the services, so on and so forth, including bed reservation, which is one of the things that we've looked into. Near term, what we've talked about is putting our daily census on our website, so that anyone who wants to know at least what the current census is, granted it changes every day, but that is one thing that we've talked about, as well as our permanent housing. That one would be a little bit more, less frequent because it's not a daily change, but our goal is to put as much information on our website as we can so that individuals can go out. We actually do that now with our service days. Every week we post where we are going, what the locations are, so that the community and the providers know, especially if they have participants or clients that they're working with, that we're coming there to do a service day or an encampment resolution, depending on the needs.
So you've already put out the RFP. There is funding for this available? Is it being funded?
Yes, but as the council member mentioned, it is federal funds, so it's one of the projects that we have, or part of it is federal and part of it is general funds, but it's part of our continuum of care.
How about the enhanced phone system? Is that out? What kind of change would that have to be? Is that an internal City of Philadelphia change, or is that something that you would?
We would have to work with OIT to look at exactly what is changing. What the team has started drafting is what it would look like even from an IVR system, which is, simply, you can either say or push the button on what the services you need are so that you can get directed to the right location. I would also add one of the changes we did do in technology in our intake is we're using a queue list system. In the past, people came in, they signed their name, and they just waited to be called. Now, we're using technology so that there's a unique ID that posts so that they can see when it's their turn, rather than, coming in and writing on paper what they need and then hoping that someone can read their handwriting.
Excellent. Last comment is that I am very excited for Fresh Start PHL, which I know will enhance the support that you're giving people when it would, whether it's to triage them to ensure they're not going into the shelters, or to help them have a quicker and safer way out. So looking forward to having more of those conversations with you. Thank you.
Thank you. The chair recognizes Councilman Ketty Lozada, then Young, and then Majority Leader Richardson will wrap us up.
Thank you, Council President. I actually walked out because I was trying to respond to an issue that was related to homeless services in the office, and am trying to figure out your process, right? We have an individual who is living in an alleyway, who has been throwing urine on people and consistently fighting with the residents, breaking into their homes, and we're being told that OHS can't do anything about it. I'm trying to figure out your process, and as we work towards improving the quality of life in Kensington when situations like this occur, how are we gonna respond to them, right? What's different from what you've been doing in the past now?
Thank you. So to address any criminal activity, the one thing that we communicate to everyone is the answer is still to call 911.
They have?
Yes, and then the other part with behavioral health, we definitely advocate for 988. Well, we have been working again with DBH IDS to make sure that when people call homeless outreach, that information is also shared. But ultimately, if there's a crime being committed, has been our answer, is to still call 911. I do agree that we are limited in that scope, that if it's a crime, 911, and then if there's a mental health crisis, 988. However, outreach and all of those teams that are out there, they are aware of those same services and hopefully are be able to share that information. But again, because outreach is a separate entity, I think DBH might be able to explain a little bit more, and I would have to defer to them on what outreach is doing there. But if they call us, that is usually our response, is to call one of those numbers for crimes that are being committed.
I'm concerned because community residents are going to become emboldened, right? that I have a bunch of residents now on a block who are extremely frustrated. They've called homeless services, they've called 911, they've called 311, and can't get a response to do something with this individual or help them respond to this individual who is also exposing himself to people on the block. And so they are now committed to taking matters into their own hands. I have seniors who are living with unsheltered people on their porches who have also been threatened and can't get these people off of their private property. And so we're going to continue to push to improve quality of life in the Kensington community. And we understand that community residents have to be partners, but at some point, folks are going to get sick of responding through the process if the process is not supportive of them.
Can I, council member, if we could connect during the break to get the information about that particular person, I'll have DBH IDS send someone from Crisis out now, today.
Thank you. Thank you, Council President.
Thank you. The chair, quick question. How many homeless teams that we have going out specifically dealing with also mental and behavioral health? That's a part of our strategy to get people off the streets.
OHS has 4 teams that go out, but again, because it's a collaborative effort, DBH IDS has quite a few more teams that they contract with, and we can certainly partner with them to get that information to you, but they would have that more accurate number.
Yeah, please do. But I just want to know, separate from DBHIDS, right? I'm thinking because OHS deals with those who are homeless, right? And we want to get people off the streets, right? We're not even really looking at incarcerating because of individuals homeless, but the goal is to actually get them off, and obviously a lot of it deals with mental health, right, and mental stability. And so I want to get an idea from your department, right? You said 4 teams, but DBHIDS has additional teams. Were you looking to expand your own teams because of the level of homelessness that we're dealing with? Because DBHIDS to me is just, it's a different conversation compared to your role is specifically getting homeless people off the street, right? And so I would think we would have an aggressive strategy with the mental health piece to try to get people off the streets that sometimes may not want to get off the streets because of the mental health issues that they're dealing with.
Yeah, and thanks for that. And you're right. You know, we do need additional resources, but the individuals that we're seeing on the street these days have co-occurring diagnosis, meaning their mental health and substance abuse underlying.
You said dual diagnosis, right?
Yeah, they're dual diagnosis.
Yeah, familiar with it.
So we do need additional staff that can help focus on that. But again, we work with our partners at DBH who has some clinical level staff that can do that, but we will welcome that.
Thank you. Councilmember Jeffrey J. Young, and then Majority Leader will take us home.
Thank you. I'll just get both my questions on the record. The first question is, over the summer, I met some young women who are staying in the shelter in my district, and they basically told us that from 9 to 3, they kick them out the shelter with no services, nothing like that is provided. And also, as a meal, all they feed them is tuna and lettuce, right? So can you tell us what the, I guess, is there a standard for meals to be provided in shelters, and if there are other social services that are required by the shelter to provide to some of their participants? That's the first question. And the second question is about Philly Home at Girard. I know Councilmember Brooks asked for her question is my question. She asked for it to be in writing. I'm asking if you can put it on the record. Like, what is the process to get what's the intake process for Philly Home at Girard? Who are the participants? Is it only for folks who are experiencing substance abuse, or does the mobile outreach workers, are they able to get folks from anywhere in the city to provide them with shelter at Philly Home at Girard?
Thanks for that question. I'll answer the first part as it relates to food quality and shelter. So we provide 3 meals and a snack in all of our shelters, and we follow the city health department healthy meal snacks. And if there's a children and food program, we follow what we call CA, children and food programs. There's child nutritionist program that we have to do with protein, grain, fruits, and so forth. So if anyone is reporting that they have not gotten a meal, this is part of our standards. We have a food service unit that go out and monitor food quality in all of our shelters, so we definitely want to know that, Councilman Young.
So do they know when you're coming to monitor that? That's the thing, right? Because at that same day, I went to the shelter, knocked on the door, and they looked like they saw a ghost. They like, oh no, right? Because they know what's going on. And so I'm just asking, I know on similar lines of what Councilman Jones and Harity said, I mean, we cannot let them know when you are coming out, because then things are totally different. And I said, when I spoke to these young women who are parents, they're just sitting in the park all day long because there's nowhere else for them to go. The food is horrible, right? And so they're sitting in the park eating like crab platters, right? Because they're not allowed to go back in. So what are the I guess the protocols again for that, for your shelters, for the food and again, the level of service that the participants are getting throughout the day to lift them out of that situation?
Yeah, absolutely right. There are some monitoring visits that the provider is fully aware, but we can increase, and we are going to increase more unannounced visits during those meal times to make sure that we have additional eyes on that and those type of issues there.
And if you don't mind, I would love to get information on which one you're specifically talking about, because I want to be able to address that as well, because we do have a standard that we want people to, everyone should be able to have a decent meal, and crackers and tuna is, or whatever it was that it sounds like you were describing does not sound acceptable. Philly Home at Girard, I will say, is divided into 2 programs, and I can speak specifically to the OHS floors at Philly Home at Girard. That comes through our intake process. The individuals that come there is shelter-based system. The 5th and 6th floor are DBH IDS ran floors, so they would be able to describe a little bit more about that process. I do know it's low barrier, and what we are looking at that building is not separating necessarily the services offered by who runs the floor, but being able to provide services to anyone who comes in there. So there's behavioral health staff that's in the building that comes in and provides services. There's medical opportunities. There's, Narcotics Anonymous, that they're trying to stand up. So all of these are for the benefit of anyone who comes in. However, the OHS ran floors come through our intake process.
So how do they get to your intake process is my question. It's like, is it through your outreach workers? Is it like, can someone, if I'm experiencing homelessness, can I go to that facility and say, hey, I'm experiencing homelessness? Can I do intake on site? Like, what is the intake process?
So our intake process for our floors are similar to any of our shelters. They can go to any of our intake sites. They can indicate from an outreach provider that they are willing to come in. They will either bring them to intake or make the phone call directly to us. We are piloting a process with outreach that they don't have to bring someone to intake. If it's somebody that's known, they can call. Our team will then work with them to get them placement without having to come to an intake site. So our goal is the moment that someone's ready to come in, that we are placing them somewhere. But so for our floors, yes, there is a process, but that process is multifaceted. You can go to outreach, you can go to an intake site. They can meet with like mobile assessors, just depending on where they are, we want to be able to try to get them in. It may not be specific to that site. It might be based on the availability of what we have at any of our sites, but I don't want the impression that they have to go to one specific place to get to our floors at Philly Home at Girard.
And what's the total number of beds for your floors at Philly Home at Girard?
It is 132.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Majority Leader Gilmore Richardson.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Council President, and thank you, colleagues, and thank you again to the team. I'm going to submit the balance of my specific detailed questions for the record, only so that we get clarity to understand, like, if there's any underspend and how to plan for next year within our budget process. I want to end on case management and sort of how people traverse the system, because I think that's sort of the most important part that we need to continue to understand. You all had stated that case managers have the following caseloads. So 1 per 25 families or 1 per 35 participants. You had also mentioned that 80% of the case management costs are covered by state and federal grant funds, a total of $2.9 million from the state and $1.2 million from the federal government. And then the additional 20% of those costs are covered by the general fund, so a large majority are grants revenue. Do we anticipate any reductions in case management funds, either from the state or the federal government at this point? And I think keywords are going to be at this point. And how are we preparing in case we see any unanticipated reductions in those funds from a general fund perspective in particular? And how much does the city spend on case management out of our general fund in total? And then is there a national standard or best practice for case management ratios for us to understand the information that you all shared relative to the families and the participants? If there is a standard or best practice, what is it? And what would it cost us to reach that particular level? And then finally, what are the qualifications? This is on my workforce development hat to be a case manager. What level of training do they receive? How often do these trainings take place? And one of the things I think we hear is around the process delays from the case managers are regularly cited as issues for participants who are looking to get into permanent housing. So how often are you all evaluating those policies and processes and evaluating the case managers?
Thank you. So the best practice depends on the vulnerability of the population, but it can range anywhere from 1 to 15 to 1 to 25, as you mentioned, just based on what the population may need. And with that, I would say to qualify, it just depends also on the services. So there are certified peer specialists that may work at some sites, certified recovery specialists. Some sites use what are called support specialists that come in and help with some of the case management needs for the individuals.
So meaning with the numbers that you all provided, the 1 per 25 and the 1 per 35, and the 25 is for families, 35 for participants, do you break that down based on the particular population? You understand what I'm saying? Based on your response, how do you break that down?
Are you saying the ratio?
Meaning, yes, so I asked about any best practices around case management ratios, and you said it depends on the vulnerability of the population. So what I'm saying is, are you all breaking down the numbers that you provided even further in groups, meaning mental health, substance abuse? Like, do you break it down even further and then change the ratios, or is this just an overall number?
Right now, I believe that's the overall number, but we can look at what we're provided from the different entities to see if we have the actual breakdown ratio based on the actual site.
Okay.
And the services that are provided at that site.
Okay.
And then, I'm sorry, can you give me the next question?
Yep. And then the qualifications to be a case manager, what level of training do they receive and how often do the trainings take place? And then relative to process delays that we hear about within the case management system, how often are you all evaluating those policies and the processes and also the case managers?
Thank you. So it depends on, I keep saying it depends, but it does depend on the level of service. So for example, if they're just providing linkage, and saying just feels like it's minimizing what they do, because that is still a lot of important work that they're doing. But if they're providing linkages between the person's other services, that is a different level of skill set than someone who is actually providing some of those services on site. Oh, sorry. So with that, so if they are providing some of the linkage services, then it may just be some experience, anywhere from no experience with a supervision on site, entry level, being able to provide some of those services, all the way up to social workers being able to provide the services. And again, it just depends on whether or not the site is actually doing all the case management themselves, including some of the behavioral health services, or if they're doing more linkages of services.
Okay, and I'll put the rest of the questions on the record, even around the qualifications for the case managers, because we want to understand their process. And then finally, I am committed to, and I told David Holloman this, I think last year, to visiting with the new family shelter that we worked on together, which is the reason why I started on this journey, was when the family called my office with the children, and we had to put them up in a hotel, and it just went from there. So I'm committed to visiting the new shelter in the Northwest, but I wanted to ask if we wanted to go to any of the shelters at any time unannounced, are we able to do that?
With some of them, yes. Others, it just may depend. For example, we fund domestic violence shelters and some of the other ones, so it would just depend on the nature of the shelter. But we certainly can provide you the list that you should be able to come to unannounced. And I
Okay.
welcome it, and I definitely want to know if you see things that are concerning.
Okay, that would be great if we could get the list.
Yeah.
Okay, have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. Thank you for your hard work in addressing this issue. We know it's not an easy issue to work on. And with that being said, council will be at ease until 2:30. And we will wrap up the afternoon with the fire department and license and inspections.